Ann Todd Jellis is the mother of NAACP President and CEO Benjamin Todd Jellis, along with Caroline Haskell. She's co-author of the brand new book titled Combined Destinies, Whites Sharing Grief About Racism. And we welcome Ann Todd Jellis to Sunday Journal. How are you?
I'm fine. I appreciate you having me on your show.
It is our pleasure. And let's learn a bit about you first. You're a former marriage and family therapist who has a long history of supporting civil rights. Tell us about some of the civil rights issues you've addressed, or tell us about your experiences with addressing civil rights.
Well, I think I became really active when I was about 14 years old and was one of 10 African-American girls desegregating a previously all-white girls' high school, public high school in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a year after the Supreme Court had decided to desegregate schools, and Maryland resisted the decision for a year and then was forced to obey the law. So that was the beginning of real activism. And that played a significant part of my life for 4 years.
And then also, I read that your mother was a civil rights activist as well?
Yeah, she went on protest marches and opened her mouth in protest.
Yes, ma'am. Now, so when did your son, Benjamin Todd Jellis, start showing signs that he would possibly follow in your footsteps by addressing civil rights issues?
When we live in a predominantly white community, and when Benjamin was, I think, 6 years old, maybe 7 years old, he was already reading a lot by then. And he went to the his school library and told the librarian that he had read every book in the library, and there weren't many, about black people, and he wanted the librarian to order more. And when she ran into us, I don't know, he was in college, I guess. She ran into us one day and said, "Please tell Benjamin we have the largest selection of books about African Americans in the part of California in which we live."
Thanks to that awareness, wow.
So he started very young.
Very interesting.
Always was unhappy about injustice of any kind early. And then he campaigned for Jesse Jackson when he was an adolescent, and I think that was the beginning of the real public persona.
Well, in preparation for this interview, I read an article that was published back in February by the Monterey, California County Weekly, and that article notes that you and your co-author, Caroline Haskell, believe that part of addressing the system of racism is getting past the conditioning that discourages white people from addressing it. I thought that was very interesting, and I just have to ask you to go on and explain that for us.
Well, it's been, let's see, how can I begin this? 30 years as a therapist working primarily with white clients, 46 years of being married to a white man, and we married during a time when it was actually illegal in the state of Maryland to do that, has introduced me to a tremendous amount of pain, grief, shame, guilt, frozen pain, all kinds of emotional issues around being white and being identified with a perpetrator group and living in a society that has a racist ideology. So I think probably about 15 years ago, I got a very strong feeling that if the voices of white people who are hurt by the system weren't out there, they're never out there, then we're not going to end this thing at all. It was very clear to me that activism was stopped when people feel tremendous amount of shame and guilt, that they then become silent, they become afraid of making mistakes, they can't bear the emotional state that they move into, and so they don't do anything. And we need everybody to participate.
Now, I'm certain that some of our listeners heard you say that whites in some fashion may have been damaged by the system, quote unquote, and some people may be asking how were whites damaged by the system?
Their humanity has been damaged. They separate themselves from each other, the good white people and the bad white people. Some of them can't really look at themselves in the mirror. They can't really. It's hard to be articulate about that quickly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You understand? It's just a very painful emotional state. It's so painful that they run from it. I can tell you this. When I started working on this book, and people said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I retired my practice and I'm working a book." And my husband would say the title or say the subject very briefly. They had stories to tell. It was like the stories were just falling out of their mouths, stories that they didn't feel that they had permission to speak. And we have been receiving, Caroline and I have been receiving stories unsolicited and poetry unsolicited about the ways in which people were brought up in an environment with overt racism, where a father was had lots of words of hatred against minority people, or they were not allowed to play with children who were black or brown, or they had relationships that ended because of bigotry, or it just goes on and on.
Right, and a little bit later what we will do, Ms. Jealous, we will get to a couple of specific examples so the listeners can get a better idea as to just some of the feelings that some of the subjects expressed. And once again, you're listening to Sunday Journal on 98.5 WYLD. Hal Clark's here, along with Ann Todd Jealous. She's the mother of NAACP President and CEO Benjamin Todd Jealous. She has co-authored a brand new book titled Combined Destinies, Whites Sharing Grief About Racism. And as we indicated earlier, your co-author is Ms. Caroline Haskell, and the book features testimonies from more than 50 white people, and they talk about some of their earliest memories of race and racism. And give us an example as to how you went about getting some of the subjects to candidly discuss their experiences and feelings.
Well, Caroline and I both are therapists. I think if we were not, it would have been much harder. We had to use all of those skills. Some of the people were ready to write. Most of them had not written anything like this before. I don't think any of them had ever really looked at how racism hurts them. Even the people in the book who are civil rights activists for for all their lives practically, had not examined how the system hurts them. They were focused on how it hurts targeted groups, how it is oppressive. And certainly white people have not been oppressed. But so I sent out an email, really, to friends and colleagues and said, this is what I'm going to do. If you know anyone who has a story to tell, please pass it on. And that's all I did. I did not want to send it to writers' magazines. I was afraid of being overwhelmed. And so it went out like that, and stories started coming to me. And people would write, I gave them permission to put it down any way they could get it down on paper. And then with some of them, I asked questions. I did some interviewing. Some of them I stayed on the phone with while they sobbed. One woman called 4 times and cried before she could write. The hurt, there's been no place to talk about the hurt. And so it festers. When you're hiding family secrets, when you're ashamed of the way your parents behaved, or when you were separated from childhood friends and nobody explained why, or you were cared for by a black caregiver and she was the only one who ever nurtured you in your childhood, and then you come home from school and she's been fired and you don't know where she is. All of that is very damaging emotionally.
Well, let's get into a few of the examples here, and I'm going to get you to expound on a couple of these here. And we'll start with Deb Busman. She's a college professor in Monterey, California. And I'm going to read part of what she writes here. She says here, as a white person in this country, I have been taught to see people of color as the dangerous ones. Arabs are terrorists. Mexicans are illegal immigrants. They're stealing our jobs. Young men of color are gangsters, thugs. These messages assault me 24/7 via cartoons, music videos, TV news, magazines, and U.S. history books. In this supposed colorblind society, everything is racialized when it comes to how people of color are portrayed and criminalized in the media. And she continues here, as James Baldwin reminds us, color is not a human or a personal reality, it is a political reality. And then she talks about New Orleans and some of the coverage that was given by the AP back in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. And she writes here, AP News carries two separate photos of folks wading through chest-deep waters following Hurricane Katrina. In one photo, a photo of a young African-American man. The caption refers to his looting a grocery store. And then we have in the other shot, it's a shot of a young white couple, and the caption tells of their finding bread and soda from a local store. And then she has these questions here. Who finds and who loots? Who is criminalized or unlawful? I thought that was a very powerful passage by, again, Deb Busman.
Yes, she wrote, and then the extended article is very good. I mean, her piece, which is titled When the Killers Are White. She writes, she speaks to the reality of there being a lot of killing going on by white people, and yet brown and black people are the ones that we're taught to be afraid of.
Very powerful. Once again, we're chatting with Ann Todd Jellis. And let me go to another excerpt from the book, and this one is told by a woman only known as Paula. And she writes here, the first time I had a black man as a friend, I was living in western Kansas. It was my first personal experience with discrimination. I knew a lot of people on the college campus because I worked in the cafeteria at the largest men's dorm. Several men stopped talking to me after seeing me with my friend. And she continues, now I am married to LaRue, a black man, and I have seen firsthand that people are scared of young black men, even of older black men. LaRue laughs at the looks people give him when he opens the door, and they're looking for my neighbor who is a dog groomer. He says the fear in some people's eyes is funny. They look like a deer in the headlights. Recently, he told me the story of being in the parking lot of Whole Foods and walking toward an older woman. Even though he was dressed in a shirt and a tie, she immediately clutched her purse and jumped out of the way. When I heard that story, I felt sadness. I tried to imagine myself in a situation where people would routinely be scared of me. Yet another powerful passage from this book by a woman named Paula. Talk to us more about her contribution here.
I think she's carried that pain ever since she was in college, and had no place to really talk about it. She lives in our community. They've been married for a significant amount of time. And her voice just needs to be out there because it's not singular. There are many people who feel that. They just don't talk about it. So what we wanted to do was to facilitate conversation. She calls herself Paula. Most of the people in the book include their last names as well as their first. And there's a reader's guide at the back. I don't know, Harold, if you managed to get that far or not.
Yes, ma'am. I see it here.
Yeah, we tried very hard to make the questions connect with each story and to make them applicable, certainly to white people, but also to people of color, so that interracial classrooms or reading groups or whatever or discussion groups could examine their own thoughts and feelings about this.
Ms. Jealous, I'm curious as to whether or not you and your co-author, again, Caroline Haskell, have had any readings or discussions with interracial groups about this book. Has that occurred yet?
Yes. We had the first presentation in November. The book was not published until the end of February, but we were invited to speak to an older age group in the university here, and it was an interracial group, and we gave a presentation for 20 men. I think that 18 of them were white, but 2 were people of color, and we have had other presentations where the mixture was more balanced.
And what were some of the more memorable things that happened during those discussions?
Tears, difficulty speaking when trying to talk about emotional experience with racism. These are white people I'm talking about now. Questions about how do we get out of this. A great appreciation for the book from both white people and black people so far. Black people saying, this. I'm having some questions answered. Questions I've been wondering about are being answered by these stories. White people being extraordinarily moved and then wanting to tell their own stories. And what I'm finding now in my own town is that I can hardly go into a store because of the article that you mentioned, which is it's a free newspaper, and it's a very widely read newspaper in our area of Monterey, and I can hardly go into a store anymore without somebody telling me a story.
Well, I imagine, Ms. Jealous, you've already indicated that you hope that people would continue to have more conversations about this issue. And seemingly here, we've always talked about people having conversations about race. But I think what's great about your book, we actually have something on paper to begin the conversation. And I think that may have been some of the challenges that we've had with this issue, about talking about this issue.
That's right. And most of us, regardless of racial identification, most of us grew up in homes where there may have been complaints about racism, or there may have been racist comments made. But sitting down and really having a conversation about what is all this about is rare. So there's not been much modeling for that.
Once again, the brand new book from Ann Todd Jealous and Caroline Haskell is titled Combined Destinies, Whites Sharing Grief About Racism. And Ms. Jealous, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. All the best to you. Thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.